My name is Clara, and I'm 33 years old. That number used to mean something different to me: prime of life, settled marriage, comfortable future stretching ahead like a well-paved road. Now it feels like the exact moment everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and family got stripped away, leaving me standing naked in a storm I never saw coming. You're useless now. I don't need you anymore. Those words still echo in my skull like bullets ricocheting off bone. My husband, ex-husband, Marcus, standing in our marble foyer, designer suit pressed to perfection, delivering that line with the casual cruelty of someone ordering coffee. The same mouth that had whispered promises into my ear on our wedding night was now spitting venom designed to poison everything I thought our life together meant. That was the moment I learned what it feels like when home spits you out. Not just loses you, not just disappoints you, but actively rejects you like a body rejecting a foreign organ. The house where I'd hung Christmas stockings, where I'd painted the nursery that never got used, where I'd nursed Marcus through his father's death, that house suddenly felt like a mouth that had been chewing me up for years, finally ready to spit out the bones. Before we go any deeper into this nightmare, I need something from you. Drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in the UK, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in Australia, I want to know. Don't just sit back and observe my pain like some voyeur. Tell me where in the world you are, because this story isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening in real time, in real places, to real people who thought they were safe. Now, let's dive into the story that almost killed me. The smell hit me first. That's what I remember about my first night of homelessness. Not the cold, not the shame burning in my chest like acid, but the smell of Sarah's guest room. Lavender fabric softener mixed with the mustiness of sheets that hadn't been changed in months. Foreign smells in a foreign place where I was now foreign too, displaced from my own life like a refugee from a war I didn't know I was fighting. Sarah's couch became my country for 3 weeks. Every morning I'd fold that scratchy blanket and stack those flat pillows, trying to minimize my presence, trying to take up less space in a world that had suddenly decided I didn't deserve any space at all. The couch springs poked into my hip bones, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the weight pressing down on my chest every time I opened my eyes and remembered, this is real. This is your life now. The whispers started on day 2. I could hear them through Sarah's thin walls when I'd venture out to get coffee, when I'd walk to the mailbox, when I'd sit on her front steps, because even charity has its limits and sometimes you need to give your friends space back to her, even if it's just for an hour. Did you hear about Clara? Marcus threw her out completely. I heard she didn't get a penny. Well, what did she contribute? She never worked. She just lived off his family's money for years. No wonder he moved on. Young wife, successful career, why wouldn't he? Each whisper was a small knife finding the spaces between my ribs. The neighborhood I'd lived in for 7 years, where I'd organized charity drives and hosted dinner parties and brought casseroles to new mothers, that neighborhood was now treating me like a scandal, like entertainment. Like a cautionary tale they could whisper about over their morning coffee. The shame wasn't just heavy, it was alive, crawling under my skin like some parasite feeding off my humiliation. Every time I caught someone's eyes in the grocery store, every time a conversation stopped when I walked by, every time I saw that look, part pity, part satisfaction, I felt myself shrinking, becoming smaller, becoming the useless thing Marcus said I was. But underneath the shame was something else, something that felt like standing in a house where all the furniture has been rearranged while you were sleeping. Confusion. 7 years of marriage, and I couldn't point to the moment it all went wrong. There were no screaming fights, no dramatic betrayals I could name. Just a slow erosion I'd been too comfortable to notice, too trusting to acknowledge, too dependent to confront. If you've ever felt abandoned when you needed love most, hit subscribe. And if you won't, at least be honest in the comments. Why turn away from a story that feels like real life? Why watch someone's pain and not acknowledge that it could be yours tomorrow? The call came on a Tuesday. 3 weeks into my exile, 3 weeks into discovering that rock bottom has a basement, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Usually I let those go to voicemail, creditors, maybe, or more people wanting to confirm the juicy details of my downfall. But something made me answer. Clara Davidson? This is Robert Chun from Chin, Mitchell and Associates. I was your father-in-law's attorney. My hand tightened around the phone. Richard Davidson had died 8 months ago, and his funeral had been the last time Marcus's family had treated me like I belonged. I'd stood in that cemetery holding Marcus's hand, thinking we were grieving together, thinking his father's death would bring us closer. Instead, it was apparently the starting gun for my husband's race to replace me. I'm calling because there's more to the will than you think. Those words hit me like cold water. More to the will? Marcus had been crystal clear. Everything went to him as the eldest son. The business, the properties, the investments that had built the Davidson fortune over 3 generations. Clean, simple, traditional. I'd accepted it without question because that's what wives in my position did. We accepted. I'm sorry, but I think there might be some mistake. Marcus inherited everything. Robert's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. Mrs. Davidson, did you actually read the will? The question hung in the air like smoke. No, I hadn't read the will. Why would I? Wills were legal documents full of language I wouldn't understand, handled by lawyers and executors and men in suits who knew about money in ways I never had to. I'd sat in the reading like a decorative object, nodding at appropriate moments, letting the men handle the men's business. There are hidden clauses, Mrs. Davidson. Shares of the family business that your father-in-law specifically designated for you. A deed to the Malibu property. Assets that were meant to ensure your security regardless of what happened to your marriage. The words felt like they were coming from underwater. Shares. Deed. Assets. Security. Words that belonged to a different version of my life, a version where I had power instead of just presence, where I mattered instead of just existed. But Marcus said. Marcus received the bulk of the estate, yes. But your father-in-law was a careful man, Mrs. Davidson. He loved his son, but he also saw his son clearly. He made provisions. My legs gave out. I sank onto Sarah's couch, the same couch that had been my home for 3 weeks, and felt the world tilt sideways. Richard had seen this coming. Somehow, 8 months ago, he'd looked at his son and his daughter-in-law, and he'd seen the future Marcus was already planning. He'd tried to protect me from his own son. How much are we talking about? Enough to change your circumstances considerably. Enough that your husband's current financial situation becomes very interesting once these assets are properly claimed. The line went quiet except for the sound of my heart hammering against my ribs. Marcus thought he'd gotten everything. For 8 months, he'd been operating under the assumption that he held all the cards, that he could discard me like an old credit card because I had no value, no leverage, no power to hurt him back. He was wrong. Subscribe now if you believe karma always comes back around. And if you won't subscribe, tell me in the comments, why cheer for villains instead of justice? Why root for the person who destroys lives instead of the person trying to rebuild hers? The messages started 2 days after Robert filed the preliminary paperwork. Suddenly, Marcus remembered how to spell my name, remembered my phone number, remembered that I'd existed in his life for 7 years. Clara, we need to talk. Call me. This is ridiculous. You know Dad meant for everything to stay in the family. You're being vindictive. This isn't like you. Call me back. We can work this out. Each text message was a small victory. Each voicemail was proof that the useless wife suddenly had something the successful husband needed. I didn't respond to any of them. Not because Robert advised against it, though he did, but because silence was the only power I'd ever had over Marcus, and I was finally ready to use it. There's something intoxicating about being ignored by someone who used to ignore you. For 7 years, I'd been background noise in Marcus's life. Pleasant, accommodating background noise that made his real life more comfortable. I'd learned to modulate my voice so it never demanded too much attention, learned to time my needs so they never conflicted with his schedule, learned to be grateful for scraps of his time like a dog grateful for table scraps. Now he was the one calling, texting, begging for my attention. Now he was the one whose voice carried that desperate edge I knew so well, the sound of someone who needs something they can't control. Clara, please. Dad's will was written years ago. Things are different now. I have obligations, employees depending on me. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. I understood pressure. I understood the weight of trying to hold together something that was never meant to support you. I understood what it felt like to need something from someone who'd already decided you weren't worth their time. I made a mistake. I was grieving, not thinking clearly. Come home. We can fix this. Home. The word that used to mean safety now felt like a trap. The house where I'd tried to make myself smaller and smaller until I almost disappeared, where I'd apologized for taking up space, where I'd convinced myself that being tolerated was the same as being loved. I screenshot every message. Not for evidence, Robert assured me we had enough of that, but for proof. Proof that the man who'd called me useless was now begging the useless woman for mercy. Proof that power shifts when you stop accepting the story someone else writes about your worth. The silent treatment isn't solving anything, Clara. I know you're hurt, but this is bigger than both of us. No, Marcus. This is bigger than you. That's what you can't understand. For the first time in our marriage, something is bigger than your needs, your timeline, your definition of what matters. Your father made sure of that. Robert explained the strategy over coffee in his downtown office, a space that smelled like leather and old money and the kind of confidence I'd never been allowed to develop. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe my age, with kind eyes and a gentle way of explaining legal concepts that didn't make me feel stupid for not understanding them the first time. Your father-in-law was very specific about the timing, he said, sliding documents across his mahogany desk. These assets don't transfer automatically. You have to claim them, which means Marcus doesn't know the full extent of what he's losing until you decide to take action. And if I don't claim them? They revert to the general estate after 1 year. Marcus gets them by default. So I had a choice. I could let the year run out, let Marcus keep believing he'd won completely, let the assets slide into his portfolio like they'd always belonged there. I could take the path of least resistance, the path that avoided confrontation, the path I'd been walking my entire marriage. Or I could take what was legally, rightfully mine. I could claim the power Richard had tried to give me. I could stop being the woman who accepted whatever scraps were offered and become the woman who demanded what she deserved. Sometimes silence is the loudest weapon, Robert said, watching me review the documents. Right now, Marcus is operating from a position of ignorance. He thinks he holds all the cards. That's his weakness. I thought about all the times Marcus had used silence against me. The cold shoulders, the withheld affection, the conversations that stopped when I walked into the room. The way he'd trained me to beg for his attention, to apologize for needing things, to be grateful when he finally decided to notice me again. Turnabout, as they say, is fair play. Pause for a second. Would you stay silent or confront them head-on? Comment your answer before you keep watching. Because what I chose to do next changed everything, and I need to know if you have the stomach for real justice or if you're just here for the drama. The invitation came on a Friday evening, hand-delivered by Marcus himself. I was staying at Sarah's cousin's apartment by then, another temporary arrangement in a life that had become a series of temporary arrangements, when the doorbell rang and suddenly there he was. My husband, standing in the hallway like he belonged there, like the last month of radio silence had been some minor misunderstanding we could smooth over with a conversation. Clara. His voice was softer than it had been in years, the tone he used to use when he wanted something. You look good. I looked like hell. A month of couch surfing and sleepless nights and stress eating had left me pale and hollow-eyed, but I let the lie sit between us. After all, I'd gotten very good at letting Marcus's lies sit between us unchallenged. What do you want, Marcus? I want my wife to come home for dinner. Mom's making your favorite. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Your favorite. Like he remembered what that was, like he'd ever paid attention to what I preferred, like his mother had ever cooked anything I specifically liked instead of just cooking what the Davidson family had always eaten. But underneath the cruelty was something else, desperation. Marcus needed me at that dinner table. For the first time in our marriage, I had something he couldn't take by force or manipulation or the slow erosion of my will. I had legal documents and a lawyer and assets that existed independent of his permission. Tomorrow night, 7 o'clock. Just family. Just family. The same family that had watched him throw me out without a word of protest. The same family that had closed ranks around him the moment I became inconvenient. The same family that had spent the last month pretending I'd never existed while they enjoyed their Sunday dinners and holiday planning and the comfortable assumption that they'd successfully excised the tumor of my presence from their perfect lives. I'll think about it. Clara. Marcus stepped closer, and I caught the scent of his cologne, the expensive one I'd bought him for Christmas 2 years ago. Don't make this harder than it has to be. We're family. We can work this out. Family. The word that had once meant everything to me, the word I'd shaped my entire identity around, the word that had become a cage I'd helped build around myself. We're family, so you accept less than you deserve. We're family, so you don't ask questions. We're family, so you smile and nod and disappear when your presence becomes uncomfortable. I'll be there. The lie came out smooth as silk. I had no intention of showing up to play the role of the grateful, apologetic wife who'd learned her lesson and was ready to come home with her tail between her legs. But Marcus didn't need to know that yet. Marcus could spend Saturday anticipating his victory dinner, could tell his family that he'd handled the situation, could believe for one more day that he was still in control. I spent Saturday afternoon with a personal shopper at Nordstrom, using the credit card Robert had helped me activate, a card linked to one of my newly discovered assets. 7 years of marriage to Marcus had taught me the language of power in his world, and that language was spoken through appearance, through the subtle signals of wealth and confidence that his family understood instinctively. The dress was sleek black wool, fitted but not tight, expensive but not flashy. The kind of dress that whispered rather than shouted, that suggested power held in reserve. I had my hair done at the salon Marcus's mother used, had my makeup applied by the same artist who'd done my wedding day face 7 years ago. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a stranger. Not the pale, defeated woman who'd been sleeping on other people's couches for a month, but someone harder, more polished, more dangerous. Someone who looked like she belonged in the Davidson family's world not because she'd married into it, but because she'd earned her place there. Subscribe right now if you've ever wanted to show up strong in front of those who doubted you. And if you won't, drop a comment. Why not? Why not root for the underdog who's finally learned to fight back? The house looked exactly the same. Same imposing colonial facade, same perfectly manicured lawn, same sense of old money and older traditions that had always made me feel like an imposter. But walking up that stone pathway felt different this time. I wasn't approaching as the desperate wife hoping to be let back in. I was arriving as a woman who had every right to be there, who had legal documents in her purse that gave her more claim to this lifestyle than Marcus's new girlfriend would ever have. The door opened before I could ring the bell. Marcus stood there in his favorite navy blazer, the one I'd helped him pick out for his father's funeral, and for a moment his careful composure slipped. Whatever he'd been expecting, humble Clara, broken Clara, grateful to be home Clara, it wasn't the woman standing on his doorstep. You came. I said I would. The foyer felt smaller than I remembered, or maybe I just took up more space now. The marble floors I'd once tiptoed across in my efforts to avoid making too much noise echoed with the confident click of my heels. The chandelier I'd dusted and polished and worried about damaging caught the light from my jewelry I'd forgotten I owned, jewelry that had been gifts from Richard over the years, jewelry that said I belonged in rooms like this. Clara. Marcus's mother emerged from the living room with her arms extended, performing the role of the welcoming mother-in-law. "Oh, sweetie, we've missed you so much." We, the plural that had never quite included me, even when I lived here, even when I'd tried to earn my place at their table through 7 years of perfect behavior and suppressed opinions and grateful acceptance of whatever role they assigned me. Margaret. I submitted to her embrace, but didn't return it. Let her feel the difference in my energy. Let her sense that something fundamental had shifted in the month since they'd all watched Marcus throw me out without a word of protest. "You look wonderful." "Doesn't she look wonderful, Marcus?" Marcus was studying me like a puzzle he couldn't solve. The dress, the jewelry, the confidence I carried like armor, none of it fit the narrative he'd constructed about my circumstances. In his story, I was supposed to be broken, desperate, grateful for any crumb of attention he might throw my way. She looks different. Different. Not wonderful, not beautiful, not welcome. Different, like a familiar object that had been moved to the wrong shelf and was throwing off the room's careful organization. The dining room was set for 5. Marcus's mother at the head of the table, Marcus to her right, his younger brother David across from him, and 2 seats at the far end, one for me, one still empty. I wondered who else they were expecting, what other performance they had planned for this evening of carefully orchestrated reconciliation. "So, Clara," David said as we took our seats, "Marcus says you've been staying with friends." Staying with friends. Such a polite way to describe homelessness, such a diplomatic phrasing of abandonment. David had always been the diplomat in the family, the one who smoothed over Marcus's rougher edges, who made his brother's cruelties sound like minor misunderstandings. "I've been exploring my options." The phrase hung in the air like a small bomb. Exploring my options suggested choice, agency, power. It suggested that my absence from this house had been a decision rather than a sentence. "Well, I'm sure you're ready to come home now," Margaret said, cutting into her salmon with surgical precision. "All couples go through rough patches. The important thing is family." Family. There was that word again, wielded like a weapon disguised as a comfort. Family meant I should forgive, forget, accept, accommodate. Family meant my pain mattered less than their comfort, my needs mattered less than their traditions, my dignity mattered less than their reputation. I've learned a lot about family lately. Marcus's fork paused halfway to his mouth. He could hear something in my tone, some note that didn't match the script he'd written for this dinner. The grateful wife was supposed to apologize, express remorse for causing difficulties, promise to be better. "Sometimes family means making hard choices," I continued, my voice steady as a heartbeat. "Sometimes it means protecting yourself from people who claim to love you, but show you otherwise through their actions." The silence was thick enough to cut. Margaret set down her wine glass with the careful precision of someone trying not to make noise in a library. David cleared his throat, but didn't speak. Marcus's jaw worked like he was chewing words he couldn't quite swallow. "Clara," Marcus said finally, "I think you're being dramatic." Dramatic. The word he'd always used to dismiss my feelings, to make my legitimate concerns sound like hysteria. Dramatic when I asked why he came home so late. Dramatic when I questioned why his female colleagues needed so much of his personal attention. Dramatic when I suggested we should talk about the growing distance between us. Am I? 2 words. Simple, quiet, but loaded with months of suppressed anger and years of swallowed dignity and decades of being told that my version of reality didn't matter as much as everyone else's comfort. The front door opened and closed with the sound of expensive heels on marble. Marcus's face brightened in a way it hadn't when I'd arrived, in a way it hadn't brightened for me in years. "Sorry I'm late." A voice called from the foyer, young and bright and confident. Traffic was insane. She appeared in the doorway like a magazine ad for everything I wasn't. 26, maybe 27. Blonde where I was brunette, tall where I was average, glowing with the kind of health and energy that comes from never having your spirit systematically eroded by someone who claimed to love you. "Everyone, this is Jessica," Marcus said, standing to pull out her chair. "Jess, this is my wife, Clara." Wife. Present tense. Like our separation was temporary. Like she was just meeting the woman he was currently married to rather than the woman he'd replace her with. Like I was supposed to smile and nod and make polite conversation with my replacement while we all pretended this was normal, civilized, sophisticated. Jessica extended her hand with a smile that seemed genuine. Clara, I've heard so much about you. I'll bet you have. I wondered what version of me Marcus had shared with her. The bitter wife who didn't understand him? The ungrateful woman who didn't appreciate his success? The deadweight he'd finally found the courage to cut loose? If that moment gave you chills, hit subscribe. And if it didn't, at least explain in the comments why betrayal doesn't shake you. Why doesn't it bother you to watch someone get replaced at their own dinner table? Well, Margaret said with forced brightness, isn't this nice? We're all here. All here. Like this was a family gathering instead of an ambush. Like Jessica belonged at this table as much as I did. Like 7 years of marriage could be erased by simply rearranging the seating chart. Marcus tells me you're in marketing, I said to Jessica, cutting into my salmon with precise movements. If they wanted to play this game, I'd play it. But I'd play it by my rules. Brand management, actually. I work with luxury hotels. It's fascinating how you can completely transform a property's image just by controlling the narrative. Controlling the narrative. How perfectly fitting. I wondered if she'd helped Marcus craft the story of our marriage's demise, helped him transform himself from the husband who abandoned his wife into the victim of an incompatible relationship. Narrative is so important, I agreed. Sometimes people accept one version of events without questioning whether they're getting the whole truth. Marcus's hand tightened around his wine glass. Clara, maybe we should. Should what? Should I not participate in dinner conversation? Should I not ask questions about your friend's work? I turned to Jessica with a smile that felt sharp as broken glass. I'm just curious about your expertise in narrative control. It must be useful in all kinds of situations. Jessica glanced between Marcus and me, finally sensing the undercurrents she'd walked into. It's really about understanding what story resonates with your target audience. And what story resonates with Marcus? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire everyone could smell, but no one wanted to acknowledge. David shifted in his seat. Margaret reached for her wine glass again. Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear into his expensive blazer. Clara, Marcus said with forced calm, I think you're misunderstanding the situation. Am I? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've invited me to dinner to meet my replacement. Is that the correct understanding of the situation? Jessica is a colleague. A friend. Friend. The same word he'd used to describe the woman before Jessica and the woman before her. Marcus collected female friends the way some people collected wines, always sampling, always comparing, always keeping his options open. How lovely that you have so many friends who happen to be young, attractive women in your industry. What are the odds? Clara. Margaret's voice carried a warning. This is inappropriate. Inappropriate. Like my presence at this table was the problem. Like my reaction to being replaced was more offensive than being replaced, like I was somehow violating the rules of civilized behavior by refusing to quietly accept my demotion. You're right, Margaret. This is inappropriate. But probably not in the way you mean. I set down my fork and reached into my purse, pulling out the manila envelope Robert had prepared for me. Legal documents, property deeds, financial statements, evidence of the power I'd never known I had, proof that Richard Davidson had seen this moment coming and tried to protect me from his own son. I have something that might change the conversation. Marcus went very still. Clara, what are you doing? I'm controlling the narrative. I spread the documents across the white tablecloth like playing cards, each one representing a piece of the Davidson empire that Marcus thought he owned completely. The Malibu property deed. Share certificates for the family business. Investment portfolios that had been quietly building in my name for years while I thought I owned nothing but the clothes in my closet. What is this? Margaret whispered. This is what Richard left me. What he made sure I would have regardless of how his son chose to treat me. This is my insurance policy against ending up with nothing after 7 years of marriage to a man who apparently considers wives disposable. The silence was absolute. Even Jessica seemed to understand that she'd walked into something bigger than a simple family dinner, something that involved more money and power than a marketing executive's salary could comprehend. Marcus's face had gone pale. Dad never told me about this. No, he wouldn't have. Because he knew you, Marcus. He knew exactly who you were and what you were capable of, and he made sure I wouldn't be left with nothing when you finally showed your true colors. Clara, sweetheart, Margaret tried, her voice shaking slightly. I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're family. We would never. You would never what? You would never stand by and watch Marcus throw me out? Because that's exactly what you did. You would never let me be homeless while you enjoyed your family dinners? Because that's exactly what happened. You would never prioritize his comfort over my dignity? Because that's been the pattern for 7 years. I stood up, gathering the documents with steady hands. But here's what you didn't know, what Marcus didn't know, what none of you bothered to consider. I don't need your permission to matter. I don't need your approval to have value. And I don't need your family dinners to survive. Clara, wait. Marcus stood too, reaching for my arm. We can work this out. We can go to counseling, we can. No, Marcus. We can't. Because this isn't about our marriage anymore. This is about power and money, and you showed me exactly what family really meant to you when you decided I wasn't useful enough to keep around. I looked around the table at their faces, shocked, calculating, desperate. 7 years I'd sat at this table trying to earn my place, trying to be good enough, grateful enough, quiet enough to deserve their acceptance. 7 years of diminishing myself to fit into their definition of what a Davidson wife should be. I'm done making myself smaller for your comfort. I'm done apologizing for taking up space. I'm done being grateful for scraps from people who should have loved me unconditionally. Jessica cleared her throat softly. Maybe I should go. No, Jessica, stay. Enjoy your dinner. But understand that you're auditioning for a role in a family that discards women when they become inconvenient. Ask yourself if the salary is worth the eventual humiliation. I walked toward the door, my heels clicking against the marble floor with the confidence of a woman who finally understood her own worth. At the threshold, I turned back to face them one last time. Keep your mansion, Marcus. Keep your family dinners and your networking events and your carefully curated life. I already own what matters. The front door closed behind me with a satisfying click, sealing off that chapter of my life forever. I walked to my car, not borrowed, not rented, but mine, purchased with funds from an account I'd never known existed, and drove away from the house that had never really been my home. Behind me, the Davidson family sat in their dining room, probably staring at the empty chair where I'd sat for 7 years, finally understanding that the useless wife had never been useless at all. She'd just been underestimated. Don't just watch silently, subscribe if you believe justice should always come full circle. If not, drop a comment. Why would you walk away when truth is right here? Why choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable reality? The headlines started 3 days later. I was in my new apartment, a sleek downtown loft with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the city that reminded me every morning that I had risen above the ashes of my old life, when Sarah called, breathless with excitement. Clara, are you watching the news? I wasn't. I'd been deliberately avoiding the news, avoiding social media, avoiding anything that might drag me back into the drama I'd worked so hard to escape. But something in Sarah's voice made me reach for the remote. Davidson Industries under investigation for financial irregularities, the banner read across the bottom of the screen. The reporter, a serious-looking woman in a navy suit, was standing outside the downtown building where Marcus had his corner office, where he'd spent years building his reputation as the golden boy of the family business. Sources close to the investigation suggest that Marcus Davidson may have been using company funds for personal expenses, including real estate purchases and luxury vacations. The irregularities came to light during a routine audit triggered by recent changes in the company's ownership structure. Changes in the ownership structure. My claims to Richard's assets had apparently triggered more scrutiny than Marcus had anticipated. When lawyers started examining the books to determine exactly what belonged to whom, they'd found discrepancies that painted Marcus in a very different light than the responsible business heir he pretended to be. My phone buzzed with a text from Robert. "Did you see the news? Your father-in-law was even more prescient than we thought." Another buzz, this one from a number I didn't recognize. "Clara, it's David. We need to talk. Marcus is in serious trouble." Then another, "Please call me back. The family needs to discuss how to handle this situation." I turned off my phone. Let them scramble. Let them discover what it felt like to need something from someone who didn't owe them anything, who didn't care about their reputation or their comfort or their carefully constructed world. The scandal spread like wildfire through the social circles that had once been my world. The same neighbors who'd whispered about my abandonment were now gossiping about Marcus's disgrace. The same friends who'd avoided my calls were now leaving voicemails asking if I'd known about his financial improprieties. The same people who'd treated my divorce as entertainment were now treating his downfall as the season's best drama. I heard Clara knew all along. I overheard at the coffee shop near my new apartment. That's why she left when she did. She must have been protecting herself from getting dragged down with him. Smart woman. I always said she was too good for that family. Too good for that family. The same women who'd whispered about my uselessness were now rewriting history, casting me as the clever wife who'd seen the writing on the wall and escaped before the ship sank. It was almost funny how quickly narratives could change when the facts shifted. The investigation expanded. Financial crimes, tax evasion, misuse of corporate assets. Marcus's carefully constructed empire was crumbling like a house of cards in a windstorm. Every day brought new revelations, new evidence of the man I'd been married to for 7 years without ever really knowing him. But the most satisfying part wasn't Marcus's public humiliation. It was watching his siblings turn on each other like rats abandoning a sinking ship. David, the diplomat, suddenly became very interested in distancing himself from his brother's business decisions. Marcus's sister Catherine, who'd always treated me like an inconvenient appendage to her brother's life, was now giving interviews about how she'd always had concerns about Marcus's judgment. The family that had closed ranks around Marcus when he threw me out was now fracturing under the pressure of scandal. Sunday dinners became strategy sessions about damage control. Holiday planning turned into crisis management. The comfortable assumption that they were untouchable, that their money and status made them immune to consequences, was dissolving like sugar in rain. Margaret called me on a Thursday evening, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Clara, dear, I know things have been difficult between us, but I'm hoping we can put that behind us. You're still family. Still family." Now that her precious son was facing potential prison time, now that the family reputation was in tatters, now that she needed allies instead of accessories, suddenly I was family again. "Margaret, I appreciate you calling, but I think our definitions of family are very different. Clara, please. Marcus made mistakes, but he's still my son. And you're still his wife." "No, Margaret. I'm his ex-wife. The papers were filed last week. And I'm not interested in helping him avoid the consequences of his choices." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, she whispered, "How can you be so cold?" Cold. The word stung because part of me wondered if she was right, if the woman I'd become was harder than the woman I'd been, if survival had cost me some essential warmth. But then I remembered standing in that marble foyer listening to Marcus call me useless, remembered the month of homelessness and whispered gossip and shame that felt like acid in my veins. I learned from the best, Margaret. If you've ever wanted to see arrogance crushed, this is the moment. Subscribe now. Or explain in the comments why villains should win. Why should people who destroy lives get to keep their power and comfort while their victims suffer in silence? The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, more intimate than the grand halls of justice I'd imagined. But there was something fitting about the modest space where Marcus's empire would finally, officially crumble. After months of headlines and investigations and desperate phone calls from family members I'd learned to ignore, this quiet room would be where the last chapter of our story was written. I sat in the front row, my hands folded in my lap, watching Marcus fidget at the defendant's table. He looked older than his 35 years, gray threading through his dark hair, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when he'd thrown me out 6 months ago. Prison jumpsuit orange didn't suit him the way his expensive suits had, but it was more honest about who he really was. Judge Patricia Morrison was everything Marcus wasn't: steady, thoughtful, immune to charm. She'd seen enough white-collar criminals in her 30 years on the bench to recognize the type: entitled men who believed their privilege made them untouchable, who thought rules were suggestions for people with less money and influence. "Mr. Davidson," she said, reviewing the documents before her, "you've been found guilty of embezzlement, tax fraud, and misuse of corporate funds totaling over $2 million. Before I pass sentence, I want to address the matter of asset distribution that brought these crimes to light." She looked up at me, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Davidson, excuse me, Ms. Chin, I understand that your claim to inherited assets was what triggered the investigation that uncovered your ex-husband's financial crimes." "Yes, Your Honor. And I understand that your father-in-law, Richard Davidson, specifically structured his will to protect you in the event of marital dissolution." "Yes, Your Honor. Though I didn't know that at the time." Judge Morrison nodded. Richard Davidson was clearly a man who understood his son's character better than his son understood himself. "The court hereby confirms your legal ownership of all assets specified in Richard Davidson's will, including the Malibu property, 40% ownership of Davidson Industries, and the investment portfolios held in trust." The words felt surreal. 6 months ago, I'd been homeless, surviving on friends' charity and my own shattered pride. Now I was walking out of a courtroom as one of the wealthiest women in the city, not because I'd married money, but because I'd been deemed worthy of protection by a man who'd seen my husband's true nature more clearly than I had. Marcus's lawyer leaned over to whisper something in his ear. Marcus's shoulders sagged further, if that was possible. He'd been banking on getting those assets back, on using them to pay his legal fees and settlements. Instead, he was looking at prison time with no financial cushion to soften the landing. As for sentencing, Judge Morrison continued, "Mr. Davidson, your crimes represent a profound betrayal of trust. You stole from your own family's company, from shareholders, from employees who depended on that business for their livelihoods. You showed no remorse until you were caught, and even then your primary concern seems to have been avoiding consequences rather than accepting responsibility." She paused, letting the words settle in the hushed courtroom. "I sentence you to 5 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years contingent on full restitution to the victims of your crimes." 5 years. It felt like both too much and not enough. Too much because somewhere deep down, despite everything, I remembered loving the man he'd been before greed and entitlement corrupted him. Not enough because 5 years couldn't undo 7 years of emotional abuse, couldn't restore the self-worth he'd systematically eroded, couldn't give me back the time I'd wasted trying to be good enough for someone who'd never valued me at all. Marcus turned around as the bailiffs approached, his eyes finding mine across the courtroom. For a moment, I saw something that might have been regret, or maybe just fear of what came next. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but what was there to say? Sorry for calling me useless? Sorry for throwing me out? Sorry for replacing me at my own dinner table? I looked away. Whatever he wanted to communicate, I wasn't interested in receiving it. That part of my life was over, sealed by the judge's gavel and the sound of handcuffs clicking around his wrists. Robert walked me to my car, his expression professionally satisfied, but personally concerned. "How are you feeling?" How was I feeling? Vindicated. Terrified. Powerful. Empty. Like I'd won a war but lost something essential in the fighting. I feel like I can finally breathe, I said, and realized it was true. For the first time in months, maybe years, my chest didn't feel tight with anxiety or shame or the constant effort of trying to be someone else's definition of acceptable. Your father-in-law would be proud, Robert said. He saw this coming, you know. The last time we met, he told me he was worried about what would happen to you if Marcus ever showed his true colors. He said you deserved better than his son was capable of giving. Richard had seen it coming. While I was busy trying to be the perfect wife, while I was convincing myself that love meant accepting less than I deserved, while I was shrinking myself to fit into spaces that were never meant to hold me, Richard had been planning my escape route. Did you even read the will? Robert had asked me that first day, and the answer had been no. I'd let other people manage my fate because I'd never believed I was smart enough, strong enough, valuable enough to manage it myself. Richard's gift wasn't just money, it was the message that I mattered, that I deserved protection, that someone had seen my worth even when I couldn't see it myself. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, cameras, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Miss Chin, how does it feel to see your ex-husband sentenced? Do you think justice was served? Will you be taking over Davidson Industries? I paused at the top of the steps, looking out at the sea of expectant faces. For 7 years, I'd avoided attention, ducked confrontation, apologized for taking up space. But this moment wasn't about hiding anymore. I think justice is complicated, I said, my voice carrying clearly in the crisp afternoon air. My ex-husband committed crimes, and he's facing the consequences. That's justice. But real justice would be a world where women don't have to depend on dead father-in-laws to protect them from their own husbands. Real justice would be a world where we teach people their worth before they waste years trying to earn love from people incapable of giving it. What's next for you, Miss Chen? What was next? I owned a company I'd never worked for, controlled assets I'd never understood, had power I'd never wanted. I could sell everything and disappear, could travel the world and pretend the last 7 years had never happened. Or I could do something harder. I could build something meaningful from the ashes of my old life. What's next is learning who I am when I'm not trying to be who someone else needs me to be. If you can watch this story and not subscribe, then at least be honest. Why turn away from truth when it's right before your eyes? Why not acknowledge that this could be your story? That the person you love most could be the person who destroys you, that sometimes the only way to save yourself is to walk away from everything you thought you wanted. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room at Davidson Industries, looking out at the faces of employees who'd once seen me only as Marcus's wife. The decorative appendage who showed up to company parties in pretty dresses and said nothing of substance. Now they were looking to me for leadership, for direction, for the kind of vision that could rebuild a company from the foundation up. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the mahogany table where Richard had once conducted meetings, where Marcus had made decisions that ultimately destroyed his legacy. Where I now sat as the majority owner of a business I was still learning to understand. The quarterly reports show we're stabilizing, David said from across the table. He'd managed to distance himself enough from Marcus's crimes to avoid prosecution, but not enough to avoid suspicion. Working for his brother's ex-wife was probably not how he'd imagined his career developing, but family money was family money, and I was family money now. Stabilizing isn't enough, I replied, studying the spreadsheets that had once seemed like hieroglyphics, but now made perfect sense. Numbers didn't lie the way people did. Numbers showed exactly what was working and what wasn't, what deserved investment and what needed to be cut loose. I want to talk about the company culture, about how we treat employees, especially women employees, about what Davidson Industries stands for beyond profit margins. The room shifted uncomfortably. These men, and they were mostly men, had worked under Richard's benevolent patriarchy and Marcus's toxic entitlement. Now they had to navigate my leadership, had to reckon with the fact that the woman they'd ignored at company parties was the one signing their paychecks. I've been reviewing our employment practices, our promotion patterns, our pay equity records. What I've found is a company that talks about family values while systematically undervaluing the women who work here. I thought about Jessica, Marcus's young replacement, and wondered if she was still working in luxury hotel marketing or if she'd learned something from watching me walk away from that dinner table. I thought about all the women who'd never had father-in-laws with the foresight to protect them, who'd invested years in men who saw them as disposable, who'd never learned their own worth until it was too late. That changes now. The words carried weight because they were backed by ownership, by legal documents, by the kind of power that couldn't be dismissed or diminished or explained away. I wasn't asking permission anymore. I wasn't apologizing for taking up space. I was using the space I'd inherited to create room for others. The Davidson Industries Foundation will focus on financial literacy for women, legal aid for domestic abuse survivors, and business mentorship for female entrepreneurs. We're not just going to build wealth, we're going to build systems that prevent other women from ending up like I did, dependent on someone else's grace for their survival. After the meeting, I walked through the building Marcus had once navigated like a king. Employees who'd never spoken to me before nodded respectfully, asked questions about the foundation, shared ideas about how to improve the workplace culture. The building felt different than it had when I'd visited as Marcus's wife, less like a monument to male achievement and more like a space where work got done by people who deserved dignity and respect. My office, Richard's old office, Marcus's former office, had been completely redesigned. Gone were the hunting trophies and masculine leather furniture. In their place, artwork by local women artists, plants that brought life to the sterile corporate environment, and a view of the city that reminded me every day how far I'd traveled from that couch where I'd slept for 3 weeks, believing I was worthless. The calls still came sometimes. Margaret, wondering if I'd visit Marcus in prison. David, suggesting family holidays where we could all pretend the past year hadn't happened. Jessica, surprisingly, asking if I'd be willing to mentor her as she started her own consulting business. I declined Margaret's invitations and David's attempts at reconciliation. But I said yes to Jessica, because she reminded me of who I might have been if someone had taught me about power before I'd given mine away. The reflection in my office window showed a woman I was still getting to know. Stronger than the person who'd begged for scraps of attention from a man who'd never valued her. Harder than the woman who'd apologized for existing. But also, unexpectedly, more compassionate, not the bitter compassion of shared victimhood, but the fierce compassion of someone who'd found her way out of the dark and was determined to light the path for others. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, saw the Forbes article about the foundation. Richard would be so proud. Richard would be proud. The man who'd seen my worth when I couldn't see it myself, who'd planned my liberation before I knew I needed liberating, who'd loved me enough to protect me from his own son. His greatest gift wasn't the money or the property or the business shares. It was the message that I mattered, that I deserved protection, that someone believed I was capable of more than I'd ever imagined. The sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded me of hope. In a few hours, I'd go home to my loft apartment, to the space I'd created for myself, to the life I was building one choice at a time. Tomorrow, I'd return to this office and continue the work of transforming a company, of creating opportunities, of using power responsibly. But tonight, I stood at this window and marveled at the distance I'd traveled. From the woman who'd been called useless to the woman who owned the company. From the wife who'd accepted scraps to the leader who demanded excellence. From the person who'd tried to disappear to the person who refused to be ignored. They'd called me useless. Now I was free. Free because I'd finally chosen myself over their approval, my worth over their comfort, my future over their version of who I should be. And in that freedom, I discovered something more valuable than all of Richard's assets combined, the unshakable knowledge that I was enough, exactly as I was, without anyone's permission or approval or validation. What would you have done in my place? Would you have walked away or tried to salvage the wreckage? Would you have used your power for revenge or reconstruction? Would you have chosen freedom or familiarity? Leave your answer below, because this story isn't just about one woman's journey from abandonment to empowerment. It's about every person who's ever been told they're not enough, every person who's ever accepted less than they deserved, every person who's ever had to choose between comfort and dignity. The truth is, we all have the power to rewrite our stories. We all have the ability to walk away from people who diminish us, to claim the space we deserve, to build lives that reflect our true worth rather than someone else's limitations. The question isn't whether you'll face betrayal or abandonment or moments when the people you love show you exactly how little you mean to them. The question is what you'll do when those moments come. Will you shrink or grow? Will you accept or demand? Will you disappear or claim your space? I chose to grow. I chose to demand. I chose to claim my space. And in doing so, I discovered that the person who'd been called useless was actually the most valuable person in the room. I just needed to learn to see myself the way Richard had seen me, the way I deserved to be seen. The weight of betrayal nearly crushed me. But in the end, it taught me how strong I really was. And that strength, that knowledge of my own worth, is something no one can ever take away from me again.